All right, this is the OGM weekly call for Thursday, December 26th, 2024. It's the day after Christmas, the second day of Hanukkah, and the first day of Kwanzaa.
It's the
And I
first day.
forgot to,
It's the first day of Hanukkah.
oh, it's the first, sorry. So Hanukkah started at sunset last night. So today's counted as the first day.
Yep.
Sorry about that. Um, so today, Kwanzaa and Hanukkah overlap nicely. I mean, everybody's talking about the coincidence between Christmas and Hanukkah, which doesn't happen that often. Or is it just that the first day lands on Christmas Day? Is that the thing that doesn't happen often?
Well, any kind of syncing doesn't happen often because one is on a solar calendar, one's on a lunar calendar.
Right?
In this case, the first night of Hanukkah was on Christmas Day, which means the first day of Hanukkah is the 26th, which coincides with Kwanzaa. And yes, so what's interesting is that lots of talk about the coincidence of Hanukkah and Christmas, very little talk about the coincidence of any of these with Kwanzaa. Why might that be?
Ah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Uh,
Exactly.
Just a note, I looked it up a few days ago, and this is the only the fifth time in the last century that it's happened.
Yeah. It's like every, I don't know, 14 or 18 or 20 or something like that years. So
hmm
Jerry, can you repeat, since we didn't have the recording going, what each of the days of Kwanzaa are?
I was in fact going to do that. Thank you. Great idea. Let me go back to the 7 principles of Kwanzaa. Kwanzaa lasts 7 days, and each day has a theme. The themes run: 1 is unity, 2 is self-determination, 3 is collective work and responsibility, 4 is cooperative economics, 5 is purpose, 6 is creativity, and 7 is faith.
And you said it always runs from the day after Christmas through to New Year's Day.
Through January 1, exactly.
Cool.
Exactly. And you're right, Gil, Swahili is a historic language, so wasn't engineered or created like Esperanto. So somewhere I got that it was a simple language to pick up, but it's a Bantu language spoken by lots of people. Gonna have to consult Duolingo for a little history. The invite for this call said, "Hey, let's talk about the year. Let's look back on the year, and if you would, bring a thing that stood out for you in 2024. And it doesn't have to be, as I said in the invite, it doesn't have to be the thing that defines 2024 or the peak event of 2024. It just means I would like it to be something that is going to stick in your brain about 2024. It can be positive or negative. It can be anything you like. It might be a poem or a person. It could be anything. But why don't we start with that with Scott?
All right. Hello, everyone. What came to mind for me was don't look for the more complex thing when you haven't really tried the simpler thing. That's been kind of a theme that I've noticed. I'm always looking for the next bigger thing, and then eventually I realize there's all these simple things that I've used and discarded, and they were successful. And the reason that I'm no longer using them is I got bored, not because they actually didn't work. Because partially bored and partially seeking incremental improvement. And I think that that can be a trap for me. I believe that incremental improvement is absolutely possible, but I don't think you necessarily, how do I say this? You're an Aikido practicer, are you not?
Right.
I'm wondering if you have a bunch of new moves, or if you're simply working on the old moves to improve balance, improve flow, improve competence with the same moves. And so that's kind of analogous to what I'm talking about.
If I may, do you want to keep talking? I'm happy to
No,
talk about that.
just a kickoff.
I'll come back to you. Aikido is a lovely analogy here because there's a limited number of ways the human body can move, right? And Aikido is all about interacting with another person and then usually pretending they're attacking you in some way, a punch or a grab of the wrist or something like that. And then we almost always, we very often start with the same damned move. It's called Tenkan or Taino Henko, which is just somebody grabs you on the wrist and you spin and take their energy in some new way. And you are right. You're constantly discovering, oh, hell, I don't know how to do this. Or somebody comes in and you have a new teacher who teaches it in a different way and shifts your idea of that same exact move or whatever else. And from that move, a whole bunch of other throws and pins emerge. But there's this whole notion that you receive the attack in some way. And so you do a lot. And then every now and then somebody does a new move somewhere in class, usually like deep into a class, who'd be like, oh, I've never seen that before. And that's intriguing, but it's the exception because most of the moves, most of the throws you're very familiar with. If I watch Aikido videos online, I can name all the throws that people are doing pretty much because they're really well known. And there's only so many ways your wrist will go, your shoulder will go, the body will go in different ways. But it's very much about deepening your understanding. And it's also amazing how I am nowhere near having internalized Aikido in my body. And the people who teach me in my dojo here in Portland, somehow, I don't even know how, and every now and then I try to ask them, have it deep inside so that they're never lost. They know where everybody is. They don't goof while showing stuff. They'll be in the middle of something, they'll reverse it, they'll do something else, and their sense of orientation in it is completely grounded in a way that I haven't gotten to. And I think that getting to that is part of the journey or process or reason for doing this over and over again. And it's not boring. One of the logics for me for doing Aikido is, do I want to do burpees for 25 minutes or do I want to get thrown around and throw other people around for an hour? And that's the same kind of equivalent exercise because you're getting off the mat all the time. And for me, like the burpees wouldn't change all that much, but boy, this thing does constantly in every little interaction because you partner up all the time. It's a partner art. Very seldom are you doing something all by yourself. And so when you partner, your partner is always different, and they're different in experience, and they're different in height, and they're different in strength and build, right? And so that changes every move every time as well. So thanks. That was a really nice. Burpees are when you squat, you take your legs back, you squat, and you jump up, and then you do the whole thing all over again. It's known as a burpee. It's an old calisthenics, an old phys ed warm-up routine, like jumping jacks. It's like the next step after jumping jacks. And now I'm
Self-reference, no interaction.
yeah.
The burpee has a history actually in the military too for testing and getting groups in theory more fit without having a lot of training. Down, up, down. So that's interesting about the Aikido. I think that you nailed it. What I was fumbling for, which is that idea of improvement doesn't necessarily mean finding a new thing. Whoops. It can mean, for me, I'm focusing on finding a deeper understanding of what I already know. It's all too easy to just say, oh, I know that. I already know that. There's nothing new here. And I find that that's rarely the case. So,
All the more so, Scott, in interactions with other people, right?
for sure.
I know them. I know what they're going to say. I know what they mean. And instead, being open to the possibility of surprise or newness or something new there.
Yeah. Thank you, Gil.
Important. I'm struck by what you said about the deepening. I've encountered a lot this year. I don't remember from who the first time. The notion of 1% improvement, repeated 1% improvement per day or per month or per whatever, exponentially gives you enormous change over some period of time. It sounds like a little, but it turns out a lot if it's consistent. And so, Jerry, my thought to your question about, how come some people have it incorporated in their body and others don't is it's practice. That's why it's called practice. It's just,
Mhm.
it's cultivating the body and the nervous system, everything else, so that it's over time it becomes, it's like a musician learning scales. And then eventually, maybe they can play without sheet music, and eventually maybe they can improv and so forth. But it starts with, repetitive fundamental stuff, which for me, I remember as a kid sounded so boring. Took a long time to understand the value of the boring.
Well,
Mhm.
and it's so easy to want to start with the tip of the pyramid, if you will, all the fancy stuff, and yet you'll never get there
Yeah.
if you haven't built that base.
Yeah.
Scott, your story also reminded me of one of my first consulting engagement moments, which was I was on an engagement for I think it was a health insurance, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Missouri was, I think, our client. And I was sent off to do some analysis. I came back and I'm reporting into the partner in charge of the project. And I start talking about stuff. And he's like, no, like, how many subscribers are there and what categories do they break into? That's all he wanted to know. And I was 3 miles down the road trying to do stuff that I, in retrospect, had no business even sort of trying to do. And the place he got to was there was a break point where behavior above a certain line, certain size of group was very different from above and below that line. And like stats were different, numbers were different. He found like a simple dividing point in some of the simpler stats around the client. And that always came back to me later. I was like, oh, wow, you need to start with the simple stuff and try to get that right as well. Cool.
So
Anything else? Go ahead.
So the whole Kwanzaa conversation was very interesting to me because I admit I have zero understanding of it, no background, no. I was shocked that it's 58 years old. I just looked it up. And so I'm not sure why that shocks. It just it felt like something I've heard my whole life and assumed that it was generations and generations back, like some of the other traditions that you had mentioned. And yeah, I'm not sure what to do with that, but I think it's interesting, and I think it relates to this progression over time on the core things, and I wonder how much is this an iteration fundamentally of other things, or is it something new? And can you have something of this profundity be created within a generation? I don't know.
Well, yeah,
So
apparently it's creatable at any moment by anybody. It's just that it doesn't happen very often, right?
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Stacy, go ahead.
Did
I
you
could,
see
I
my
could,
breath?
I saw you draw a breath.
I thought there was an interesting comment made about the order of the principles, because
Yes.
to me, the order actually made a lot of sense because I see two cycles within that order. And I see one as the beginning cycle where the members are actually knowing themselves at the same time as being in community. And then the second part is a bigger iteration. And that's just how it hit me. But I just wanted to mention that it was different from the comment that was made.
Makes sense. Um, Anyone else with a thing that stood out for them in 2024? Matthew, that the invite, which is where we're heading back to now, was what stood out for you in 2024. Doesn't need to be a big thing or characteristic of the whole year, but we're just picking places to start and then going from there. Scott had talked about how sometimes you get distracted by the more complex thing when the simpler thing will do. And that took us into a super interesting set of discussions, and we're sort of back on that. Alistair, I think you just held up your hand.
Yes, yes. So first I wanted to, yeah, the discussion about practice reminded me of quote, that quantity has a quality all of its own.
Mm,
And that is sometimes attributed to Stalin, but maybe it wasn't him. But anyway, and that's a quote that I like to reflect on every now and again, and uh, yeah, and
there's
mhm,
very tiny aside on that.
uh-huh,
Um, uh, Peter Norvig of Google wrote a paper called the unexpected effectiveness of big data or something like that. I'll find it and I'll
uh-huh,
post it in the
uh-huh,
link. But it's very much
mhm,
the playing out of that they discovered that when they
mhm,
had very large quantities of data, their
mhm,
ability to do things or learn things with it changed dramatically. Back
mhm,
to you.
mhm. Yeah, yeah. And I guess the uh, achievements of LLMs, is much of it down to just large quantities of data. No, it's not just the quantity, but certainly the quantity plays a large part as well. And it's also, I guess LLMs also show the limitations, that even with all that large quantity of data, they still manage to mess things up that uh, humans might do much better with much smaller quantities of data. But anyway,
Hmm.
uh, yeah. Um, yeah, regarding things that stood out for me, uh, is just things in my personal life. So one is that uh, I mean, I've always been involved in some NGO or political sort of organization here and there. But this year I got more involved, partly because there was elections in Europe, and yeah, so I'm part of the background team for a small new party, Green Party, that's starting in Malta.
Mm.
So that's, yeah, something that uh, yeah, that was important for me. And something else that yeah, that I also started getting a bit more involved back in uh, mathematics, uh, working with some person I know that at university. That's also good. Yeah, yeah. So that's it for me. Thanks.
Love that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Um, Howdy, Ken. We are just going around asking what things stood out in 2024. Um, Go ahead, Scott.
I have another, I have another theme that I think will resonate. So this is the year of my 40th high school reunion.
Yeah,
And I
your
went.
voice is really soft. Can you turn your
Oh, I'm
volume up a
Yeah,
sorry.
little?
yeah.
Okay.
I think your
Um,
your microphone is not the one you think you're using or something.
Well, it's is known to be. Give me just a moment, and I will.
Yeah,
Okay, probably should be better like that.
it sounds about the same, but if you, hmm,
Is it louder? Louder now? How about now?
not perceptively, but we can hear you. It's just that your voice is a little low.
All right. Well, how about I enunciate and project?
Sounds great.
That will be better. Okay. So I went to my 40th high school reunion, and the theme here is going to be reconnecting. And it's something I encourage you all to try to do if you can. So the people that I thought that I would be excited to see was kind of a bust. The people that I hadn't even like connected with at all were terrific and we're still in contact. There were people that I had been good friends with that I had just forgotten about. I mean, after 40 years, it's funny how that can happen. And then as a result, there's been a lot of fallout as I've been reconnecting and friending and that sort of thing, or not fallout, ripples.
Hmm.
So an old middle school teacher I've reconnected with, and I've been able to express gratitude to that person, and then find out that they've published 4 books, and oh wow, look at all this stuff that's going on. And I used to ride on the bus from Detroit to Minneapolis, which is a 16-hour car drive. And it was a long way. And I would always find someone in the bus station. I would pick someone. You know, I don't know why, but I want to sit next to you.
Hmm.
And we had great conversations. And I still remember all of them. So he reached out to me, one of the guys. It's been 30 years. We haven't talked since a bus ride. And it turns out that I sent him something in the mail, which I'm known to do, that related to what we were talking about. And he's gone on and he's followed that same path since he was an 18-year-old. So I encourage you, if you have the opportunity, to not just think about those people from your past, to actually make the effort, send a little note. If it results in, well, I can't see how it would result in nothing, because just you writing the note is important, whether they respond or not. So that's my theme, I guess, is reconnection.
Love that. Thanks, Scott. Matthew, in the chat, you just put Whitewind and NCANs. Whitewind, I think, is an at proto blogging tool, which I only heard about like a week ago from Pete Kaminsky, and NCANs doesn't even Google. So do you want to step? Do you want to step in and explain?
I need to make sure I got it right. Neural cellular automata based neural networks.
So there's probably a B in there.
They're probably we skipped that. You know, does everybody know about Simon Conway's Game of Life? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, there were a couple of people shaking their heads. So Simon Conway's Game of Life, I mean, this was invented back before PCs had graphical user interfaces. This is like early 80s, right? It's just a computer program, and it divides the screen up into a grid, and you put a cell in a grid like a living cell, but it's just a pixel, right? But you give it some rules, and the rules say if certain conditions are met regarding your neighbors, create a copy of yourself. And you can write these rules differently. You know, if you have no neighbors, create 2 copies of yourself in 2 random positions, one above, one below, or something like that. You can create all sorts of rules, right? And you see you get one cell that's lit up, and then another one, and then another one, and another one. But also you have some rules for cells to be unlit, to die as well. And you have incredibly simple rules, and you get quite complicated phenomena appearing on the screen. And it looks like it's alive. It was like the first, I don't know whether it was the first, but it was probably the first example of, trying to program something that looked a little bit like biology. And look it up, it's been around for decades, and it's really quite cool because you get these quite sophisticated looking patterns emerge from very, very simple rules, which is a fundamental principle of biology, right? So my son is doing bioinformatics, and as a pastime, just not part of his course, he's been looking at something like the Game of Life, but the algorithm for determining whether a cell replicates or not is a neural network, right? The neural network is a set of weights, and he creates a random set of weights to begin with using a number. You just put a number in, you get a random neural network operating in a cell, and then you just see what happens, right? And his next step is to turn that into a genetic algorithm. So you have a fitness test, and then you can actually mutate the DNA with the weights as you go from one cell to another. So when a cell reproduces, it doesn't get an exact copy of the neural network of its parent. It gets sort of like a variation of that. And then you set a task to this organism on your screen. And some cells do well and some cells don't. I mean, you distribute food across the screen, and the cells that reach the food, they survive, and the ones that don't die out. And then you just evolve that. So that's another concept called genetic algorithms, where in order to solve a problem, you actually describe the problem in as if it was DNA, but genetic DNA. Oh, sorry, digital DNA, zeros and ones, and then you just iterate and you let evolution find a solution. And he was just showing this to me over the last couple of days. It's fascinating. I don't know whether it's ever going to be a thing, but there's like one other person in Europe he's found so far who's been experimenting with this so far. And because all the attention in AI is going into large language models, and so genetic algorithms has completely fallen off the radar. But these are problems. These could solve problems when you don't know what a good solution looks like. This is a way of doing AI without back propagation. You simply set what looks like good, like survival is good and not survival is bad, and you let it run and you see whether it finds a solution or not. And so it's a way of creating biomimicry when you're not limited to the Earth's biology. You can create other biologies and be inspired by that. As like, how engineering biomimicry, you look at how a bee makes its nest, you get honeycomb, which is used in aerospace. That sort of biomimicry is a thing. And this is a way of creating biologies which are purely digital but don't look like ours, but nevertheless you can get inspired from them to solve problems. And I know it sounds very science fiction-y, but there's actually decades of work, decades of computer science in this, which is not very topical right now because everybody's looking at LLMs, of course. But this is something which I'm just getting into. And it's my son who's teaching me. It's fantastic having a kid who's actually able to teach his old man something, which I'm really enjoying. Not yet for you, Sam, but give it 20 years and this will have the same. And you're right. Yeah, White Wind is a blogging platform on the Atmosphere. It's an AT Proto thing, and I've been playing with it the last few weeks.
Oh, cool. We can come back to that in a sec because you just started something really interesting. Could you type into the chat the full name of the neural thingamabob that still doesn't Google properly as an acronym, but that way we can maybe find it.
I'm sure it doesn't because it's never been published. I mean, my son and I, William, we just came up with this like literally a couple of hours ago when we were walking the dog, and the dog is that dog.
Then I would really appreciate your putting it in the chat so I can enter it in my brain and be the first to do that.
Oh, okay. Well, it's there.
And what you were talking about reminded me also of Stephen Wolfram's book, A New Kind of Science, which basically builds out from cellular automata, which is, I think, related to a life or artificial life. I think it's very similar to it. And he builds a whole theory of how the entire universe can be constructed from cellular automata, just doing things repeatedly, which is a thesis I don't know enough to critique, but I don't buy. So that's one thought. But then also, there's a whole bunch of other models that sort of fell by the wayside. There was fuzzy logic. There were a bunch of other things that people were trying to use to make some progress. And then recently, there's Carl Friston and his applied inference, which has a lot of fans. And I'll just say a little thing, which is I don't understand people who say applied inference is going to be much better than LLMs and take over and it's the real deal, because A, I don't see them actually functioning to answer any of the questions that LLMs can today answer. But B, why wouldn't you want to have a collaborative architecture where you let each of these models do the thing it's best at and then throw the answer in the pot and figure out how to make things better? I don't know. I don't know why these things have to compete with each other rather than divide and conquer the tasks at hand.
I don't think the models compete with each other. I think the people pushing the models do compete with each other for attention and money and budget and fame and everything. But the idea of cellular automata and genetic algorithms is been around for a few decades. I mean, I discovered it with the Game of Life and a whole lot of other things when somebody wrote the first book about complexity back in the 80s. I'm sure you've got it in your brain, Jerry. Because you don't need back propagation, there are certain classes of problems which, in theory, these can solve more effectively than LLMs. But that is still, I'm not going to die on that hill. I don't know whether it's true or not. I don't know at all. I'm not a computer scientist, but it is. The thing is that these things create art in the way when you experiment with these things. If you ever watch the Game of Life, it's quite hypnotic. You get these patterns emerging, and my son's got them up on his screen too. You get these incredible structures appearing and fading away and evolving into something else, and it just goes on and on and on. And you have grades of intensity. You put in color in there, and it's quite beautiful to look at as well. It's just sort of a nice little byproduct of these experiments. But we're an enormous distance away from actually creating something useful from this. This is still very much a plaything and a theoretical idea. But it's just, you asked what stood out. It wouldn't have stood out for me nearly as strongly if my son hadn't been doing it, clearly. But whatever, it doesn't matter. It's a personal view of the year, right? So that's mine.
Love it. Love it. Totally. And we lost Sam off the call just when I was ready to go to him. I'm hoping it was just one of his kids kicking the keyboard. But who else would like to drop something into the conversation that stood out for them in 2024? Hank, please. Hank, you're good to go.
Lots of things stood out to me this past year.
Yeah, also, your audio is kind of muted as well. I don't know why.
Try to adjust something here.
Yeah, we can hear you, but it's like you're talking through cheesecloth.
That's a shame. How about this? Any better?
Yeah, yeah.
I was very intrigued by the email, Jerry, because lots of things have stood out for me in the last year, including scenes from movies that I've seen 3 or 4 times over, and each time they've taught me different things. Songs I've heard 100 times and can't stop listening to them. But what I'd like to bring into the conversation is a OGME type of question. At least I think it is an OGME type of question. I've taken several very intriguing philosophy courses in the past year. I've done lots of reading and listened to a lot of the OGM calls. So I have a question, which to me is a question about purpose. It seems to me, as an amateur in thinking about the universe, that we are heading towards or possibly in the middle of a convergence of 3 or 4 different paradigm shifts, from the material to the immaterial, from humankind as part of nature, instead of humankind supposed to subdue nature, from the individual and the bankruptcy of individualism to the arising of the collective and networked societies, from the disenchantment of the world to the hopeful re-enchantment of the world. Lots of things like that. You don't have to agree with the ones I've mentioned, but I think you might see that several paradigm shifts are converging. So the question is, what's trying to emerge? And the second question is, what can we do about it to help midwife what's trying to emerge? And the we is, of course, the big we. It's the we of humankind. It's the we of the OGM community. It's the we of me and my friends and family, and you and your friends and family. So there are 2 questions about purpose. Is something with a purpose trying to emerge, or does emergence have a purpose? And do we as humans have a purpose that is in trying to help it emerge?
Hank, I love that. If you wouldn't mind putting into the chat the 3 or 4 paradigms that you mentioned, just so we can kind of capture them, because I like them all. And anyone who'd like to build on what Hank said, please do so. I'll go. it's weird to be, there's this, I think one of the signs of maybe maturity is the ability to hold paradox. And I'm feeling there's a big sense of paradox in what I want to answer with, because it feels like we're at a moment of crisis in multiple different ways, and yet I'm optimistic. And that's what I just heard in what you said, is an optimism despite the situation outside in some sense. Um, and so um, there's different ways of asking the question. And when you say what's trying to emerge, one of the big questions I have going is, what are our next two stacks? By which I just mean, how are we going to govern ourselves in a much more fruitful way than the current assumptions and institutions we have all around us that seem to be steering us in the wrong directions more often than in the right directions? And I think that's a related question to what you're saying, but it's deeper than that, because you also touched on the resacralization of our world, which we've talked about on OGM before, which is a huge thing for me, because if I could hit a magic button, if someone made me God and said, what one thing would you do to try to change how the world is working right now? I think that would be one of them. I would ask that people, I would ask, not require, and barely even ask. I would try to figure out how to get people, damn, I don't know how to ask this even, to see one another as sacred and to see the planet as sacred. And I don't mean religious sacred, I just mean sacred, so that they might actually not harm one another, not harm it. And I think that would change so many behaviors all at once that it could in fact lead to some really good outcomes. I don't know if that resonates with you. And then when if you have any more comments there, I'll go to Stacy after that.
Just a quick comment I put into the chat. There's a book called The Reenchantment of the World by Morris Berman that speaks beautifully, Jerry, to what you were just talking about. One of my treasures.
Thank you. Love that. Hank, if you won't comment on that, let me go to Stacy.
I just wanted to add one word to that, not to make a conversation. I would throw in the word discernment, because I think that's a really big part of everything, whether we're discerning, whether it's to respond or to receive, or if it's a bigger picture or a smaller picture, the word discernment should be at the forefront, I think.
Love that. Love that. Anyone else with thoughts or comments?
Let me just come back to what Stacy just said. Long ago, I wrote lots of poetry, and one of my favorite poems was something I wrote about myself, and the poem is called "I Am a Receiver."
Love that.
Right.
Anyone
Piggyback
else
on
with thoughts on this
Stacy.
topic? Go ahead, Scott.
Piggyback on Stacy here. So Stacy, I've done a little bit of talking about DSRP theory over the past couple of years, and distinctions is discernment. It is one of the
Can't hear you.
Yeah,
Can't hear me
again, Scott.
again?
Yeah.
Again?
If you lean in or something,
Wow.
your volume is not that high.
Okay. I apologize, because I can see you so clearly. I think you can hear me so clearly, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you had talked about discernment, and one of the patterns of DSRP is distinctions, and distinctions is discernment. They are essentially analogous. But what's important about it, what I've learned about it, is that the four patterns exist simultaneously. You can't have one without the other. And why I think this is important is, to discern something, you must also have a perspective from which to discern. And the distinctions or the discernment is done in relation to other things and is part of larger groups. And so one of the challenges, I agree with you, discernment or lack thereof is a fundamental problem, because discernment and distinction making is fundamental. And it creates an assumption that we all know what we're talking about. And we find out a half an hour later that the key word that we were using, we both have different understandings of. And that's where the P comes in, the perspective. So from my perspective, I will discern this and this are separate. And from yours and from anyone else's, there will be a different discernment made. And you think, well, then how can we even talk about anything? But what that does is it says there isn't a single discernment. There isn't a single distinction. Yours is just as valid as mine. But if we don't recognize that there's two, for every perspective is going to be able to discern something in a slightly different way. Common example is you are at a baseball diamond and you see something leaning against the fence. What is it? Oh, it's a baseball bat. All right, you're out in the woods and you're cold and lost, and you see something leaning. What is it? Oh, it's a piece of firewood. It's the same thing, but when you change the perspective on it, it's gone from a baseball bat to a piece of firewood. And you can do that with anything, because that's the fundamental rule involved. And now I've gone on a little too long, but that's I just think it's a fascinating thing, because I'm tuned into hearing the words and then thinking which pattern goes with that's not being said. So
Thanks, Scott. Ken, do you want to talk about Paul Levy and Wetiko?
Good morning. Hello, everybody. Happy Boxing Day and all that, Hanukkah and Kwanzaa. There's a concept in several indigenous traditions about Wetiko, which is that there's a mind virus that, Jerry, you know the ant thing. I can never remember the name of it. The thing that turns ants that destroys them and has them cannibalize their.
Yes, it's a fungus. God,
Look in your
I'll
brain.
find it.
Zombie
Uh,
zombie
I'll-
fungus. You're talking
Yeah,
about
yeah.
zombie
Yeah,
fungus,
it's just
right?
so
Yeah.
so we've I think consumer culture, Jerry, and it's come up many times. The idea of being consumers as opposed to citizens. It rots our brains, and it turns everything into, we see the living world and like, oh, I want to cut down this enormously old tree and make a desk out of it, or use the worst thing is how much wood is used in as concrete presses for building, and then it's just tossed away. And I was thinking yesterday, I looked at the Land's End catalog. I thought, how many forests have been cut down for Land's End catalogs and Sears catalogs? And we see the world as something for human use. And this actually goes back, according to Amitav Ghosh, to the early 1500s, when in Europe there was an idea emerging in philosophy at that time that the earth is inert and it's only useful when humans are working it and creating something from it, as opposed to having its own value. And so I think we can trace the origins of Wetiko, this mind virus, to Europe, because there were perhaps earlier, but it didn't seem to be very prevalent on Turtle Island. And now, like, everybody's got it. I watched the 1951 version of Christmas Carol last night with Alistair Soon, who did a great Scrooge, and he was a perfect exemplar of mind virus. Like, why should I care about the poor? Aren't there workhouses for them? Aren't there debtors' prisons for them? I support them, and there has to be a softening of the human heart. And if the head is completely disconnected from the heart, it's really hard to have that happen. So the idea that we're going to think our way out of this, that's not the right road. We've got to do things that connect us to our emotions, to our grief. I did a lot of work with Michael Mead back in the 90s, and he talked about, we will see healing come about when we start to have public grief rituals. Same thing with Joanna Macy. There's so much trauma and so much holding the trauma from fully being experienced, of just pushing it away, that it causes us to have really screwy adaptive strategies. And I'll tell one quick story that Jack Cornfield used to tell when I was hanging out at Spirit Rock, after the Vietnam War, after Saigon fell, there was a gathering of people. A very, very famous monk from Burma led this thing, and there were about 10,000 people there. And these people had lost everything: family, friends, homes, children, parents, loved ones. Many of them had lost limbs, and they were all gathered in, and he was like, "What's this monk going to say? What's he going to say?" And he came out and he chanted, "Hatred never ceases from hatred, but by love alone is healed." And he just kept chanting that and chanting that and chanting that. And pretty soon everybody started to weep. And through that connection to, if we don't find a way to love, we're all lost. And people just they connected to their deep emotion of their longing for love. And there's this huge cleansing. It was an enormously healing thing. I think a lot of people are afraid of emotions. They're afraid of grief. They're afraid of experiencing it. And as long as we stay afraid of that, it's going to keep us stuck. So we have to soften our hearts, and we have to allow the grief to come through, and we have to turn to each other and say, I see that you're also a suffering being.
Thank you, Ken. Let's take a beat and come back with someone else's thoughts for the year. So I'll bring us back out of silence. Thanks, Ken. And I put what I think is the quote you said in the chat, but correct it if it's wrong, please. Hatred never ceases from hatred, but by love alone is healed. That's it. Thanks.
That's the story as I remember it, but it's 30 years old. So
Yeah.
But it captures the essence.
Thank you. That your theory is going to
Actually,
be put
I'm
well.
sorry. There's another piece that I forgot. Hatred
sure.
never ceases from hatred, but by love alone is healed. This is an ancient and eternal law. This is an ancient and eternal law.
Okay. Thank you. And I was going to say something, but Klaus has his hand up. So let's go to Klaus instead.
Yeah, along the same lines of having to have a change of heart before your mind changes. I just got a rude reminder on how much inertia there really is in our system, in our mind, in our worldview. So I've been working on agriculture as a core element of our culture, of our society, of our way of life, and of our survival. And in particular, the regeneration of soil, to bring life back into the soil, to restore the microbiome back to life as a fundamental principle to restore biodiversity, restore watersheds, regain nutrient value inside the food and so on. And working with several NGOs to really bring that point home, lobbying in Washington and what have you, to find this topic captured now by McKinsey, the company that just paid $650 million for their fraudulent engagement in the opioid scandal, consulting their clients to do what was clearly criminal activity. And they are now co-opting this term regenerative agriculture. And the first sentence in this article says the whole thing: millions of acres of US corn and soy crops, as well as the planet more generally, could benefit from regenerative agriculture practices. The entire premise is wrong. You cannot continue to have 180 million acres of land producing corn and soy as a monocrop. It just doesn't work. So what it means is that the industry insists on perpetuating a business model that's completely dysfunctional. It violates all the principles of nature. And there's really nothing you can do, in the way that they're proposing it that would actually restore biodiversity or bring life back into the soil. And so, you can argue back and forth about, the technical part and the engineering issues involved in, and so on and so on. But at the core, it's what Ken just was saying. Is, do you really value life? I mean, do you really understand life as a component embedded in the soil, out of which comes all other life on land? And so that was just, so now I'm going to write a rebuttal and all of these things. But you can tell that as we're going into this new year, we're going to have more of the same. It's just evasive and argumentative, and basically the intention of the conversation is to maintain and perpetuate existing business models and protect them. So that's really super discouraging. I don't, so we haven't achieved a thing basically in changing hearts and minds.
So Cliff, that's actually a great segue into what I was going to say and then didn't say, which was that given what Ken just offered us, I think that the next year is going to offer a great either training ground or dueling ground for those principles, that there is a whole lot going on in the world that is going to create antagonisms and opposites and resistance and so forth. And it's possible that melting those forces might be the only way forward. And I'm unsure. I'm missing half the words that I wanted to say a little bit earlier, but I'm trying to figure out how this goes. The thing I was going to bring up that stuck out for me in 2024 is relevant now too. I'll say that and then head back into it. And the thing that I wanted to say was, and I'm surprised more of us haven't talked politics since the year seemed very significant that way, but I will throw the fish on the table, which is that Kamala ran the perfect campaign, period. It was just the entirely wrong campaign. The Democrats ran exactly the wrong campaign. That they lost because they beat themselves. They did the wrong thing, and they did it exquisitely. Like the concerts that were being thrown and the endorsements that were showing up, and every one of those things was proof to Trump's followers that the elites were in charge and that this was, not going to work. So all of a sudden we have Trump acting as president weeks before inauguration. Biden has disappeared. We haven't heard from him. He's doing very little as far as I can tell. And all of a sudden we're already in the next Trump regime, which promises or threatens to be far more organized and maybe active than the first one, which was in many minds bad enough. And I think that setting for the year is a challenge to all of us to listen to what Ken was offering and to try to not reflexively decide that all is lost and things are terrible, but rather that there's a crack in the bell and that's where the light shines in. And maybe we can find our way toward deeply productive things. And to my mind, part of the reason that this battle is being lost is that people are not coming up with the right answers about how do we govern ourselves? How do we resacralize the world? All those things are, I think, resonant with what people would like. And the simpler thing that people would like, to go back to Scott's opening gambit, is they just want their families to be safe and to have a better future. That's really simple. All the rest of the stuff is relics of history and forces at play and politics and power and everything else. But people, I think, just want to have some, a better future for their kids is big. So I urge us. So my lesson from the loss of the election to Trump was that I needed to rethink how I was seeing the situation, how I was interpreting what had happened. So I've been doing that as best I can, and I'm interested in how that's going to play out. Of course, there's a whole series of other conversations that can spin out of that, but I will stop at that with that. Scott, please.
And thank you for bringing up A Christmas Carol. We watched our favorite version, the Muppet Christmas Carol last night.
Oh, perfect.
But what I was struck with, I'm always fascinated with storytelling, and it's a big book, I believe, or at least it's not a small book, and it's a story that has, resonated for a long time, and there's a lot of depth and richness and all that wonderful stuff inside of it, but it's also, okay, there's this bad guy, and he has an encounter with 3 ghosts in the middle of the night, past, present, future, and then because of that, he's changed. And it's like so easy to say what the story is. And I think a lot of our stories are so complicated, we couldn't even repeat them. Having heard it, now tell the person next to you the story that you just heard. And I think that's one of the master classes of the Christmas Carol, is that the structure is clear. The structure is you could tell, if you've ever seen it, you could tell the story to someone else, because once you've seen it, you know it. And I think that's where we miss out, is that we have all these stories that we want other people to know, and they just are, for whatever reason, they're not resonating. They're maybe too complicated. They're maybe not repeated enough. I don't know. But that jumped out at me, as this was a fantastic classic story. What about it makes it easily remembered and easily shared?
Thanks, Scott.
Yes,
Anyone
Gil,
else?
thank you for that. The importance of telling stories that other people can tell. That's what's repeating.
Jay Golden is a storytelling consultant. I happen to know several of them who are really good. And Jay's phrase is retellable stories. You want to tell retellable stories. Gil, you're muted.
I remember you telling us that last week. I remember you telling about retellable stories. And so I'm retelling about this message about retellable stories.
Nice.
And it goes to I think to the political question you were talking about before, is the stories of change maybe are too complex for people to retell them. And maybe there are simpler ones. There are some seeds of those in this conversation here today. Can I take my turn?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I've been reflecting since you raised the question at the start, and I find that I don't have access to the whole year. I have access to the latter part of the year. It's like an accelerating year where the recent is much more present.
Mm-hmm.
Probably always true to some degree, but much more so this year. I can't reach January, February, March in my mind, because the last half of the year is so full, and the last quarter is so full. The big themes for me are boy, it's like navigating uncertainty. Somebody, I forget who was, talked about what wants to emerge. I don't know there's anything wanting to emerge. There's stuff emerging, and there's us wanting things to emerge, but I don't know there's a teleology of its own. And what I'm present to us is the enormous contingency, like branching points in the story where things could go one way or the other, that have brought us to here and sit out ahead of us. Talked about this in prior calls. I'm feeling an enormous sense of unsettlement with the politics and the geopolitics. And boy, if you thought you had any idea what was going on, look at Syria in the last few weeks, where just everything flips in a matter of weeks, with enormous geopolitical consequences. And who could have predicted that in that time, in that moment? And I've been, as part of my spiritual practice, I've been learning to live with uncertainty, and I'm finding it harder and harder these days. I've got a personal dimension to that now with the changes in Jane's health and possibilities of our living situation. And my comfort, my ease, my ability to find center in the face of the uncertainty is much more challenged the last few months than it has been. And with Trump and now Musk and what I'm calling Trusk in the game, it's just like wild cards all over the damn place. And I find it hard to reach back to a time in history that I know about that was like this, with so many pieces loose on the deck. And I keep coming back to the one, speaking about retellable stories, the wonderful story about the old farmer and the horse, which I'm sure most people know. Something happens, this is a terrible thing. Well, maybe it is. The reverse happens, this is a wonderful thing. Well, maybe it is. And it goes back and forth so many times. Kind of a reminder that it's really hard to evaluate in the moment what's happening and where it's going to go. And last thing, and this is not to tie it together, but I remember, Scott, listening to you earlier on when you were talking about making distinctions, and your pattern of four, and thank you for that. It's something I want to reflect on more at another time. But it strikes me that one of the things that's weird about us creatures is that we are thrown to making distinctions. We're thrown to not just to making distinctions, but to categorizing. So looking at phenomenon and naming them and putting them in boxes and thinking that the boxes have something real about them rather than just a way of talking about something. We start to believe, we have retellable stories, and we start to believe our own stories in a way that's dangerous. And so I'm concerned about that process of distinction making. We can't not do it, can't orient in the world without doing it, but it goes into runaway, it seems to me. So I wonder about that a lot. And there was something else here. Yeah, I put it in the chat before, but just to mention it, we're talking about heart and mind, and I think the distinction of heart and mind may be part of the problem. It's all body. It's all living in a body that has all these pieces to it. We've often said, Jerry, you've often said, others have said, the mind is not in the brain, but we talk as though it is. And Ken, you're highlighting the three large bundles of neurons as one way at that story. All of those bundles are part of an entire coherent system of a nervous system in a body, and a body in space with other bodies, and we don't know where the boundaries are. I mean, Nora Bateson's fond of asking where does the deer end and the meadow begin? And I find that to be a very helpful kind of question to parallel the question of drawing distinctions and boundaries and categories. We are creatures who draw distinctions and are willing to kill each other over the distinctions that we draw, even though, as Scott points out, they are subject to perspective, or what I would call context. And I might draw different distinctions about the same thing in different moments with different people in different contexts. And yet, look at what we do in our, here's the other thing, in our identification with those principles. So the other thing that's been alive for me is really challenged by the whole notion of identity. and the conversation about identity in politics as one hand of it, the fierce importance of identity in some conversations, and contrast to the Buddhist notion that what's self? The fluidity and malleability of all that we are and all that we identify with. So yes, that's been present for me this year, is that contrast, tension, dance, and those concepts. So Jerry, thanks for the question.
Thanks, Gil. Hey, Jose. We've been going around the room asking what things about 2024 stood out, and we've hit a whole bunch of interesting things. Off to Stacy.
Gil, I'm sorry to hear about a change in your wife's health.
Yeah.
It's a long journey, Stacy, and we've had a little drum in it. It's quiet now, but it's sort of, we're in a period of life where there will be a lot of uncertainty ongoingly.
I wanted to go back to this idea of storytelling, because it seems to me that there's a tendency of humans to want to retell other people's stories. And I think that we miss the point that there's a need for people to be able to have the space to tell their own stories. Every human wants to be recognized in some way. And when we tell our own stories, then they come out unfiltered in a way that other people can capture the pieces that they need. Because when we tell somebody else's story, we're already filtering out parts. So we're already losing the richness. So I just wanted to share that.
Thanks, Stacy. Anyone else with something that stuck out for them in 2024? I think almost everybody has put something in. Any general retrospectives, like what?
I just want to say
Ken.
I'm also in sympathy, empathy resonance with Gil, in that similar to pre-pandemic, the pandemic did something to time where I can't remember, was this before the pandemic, after the pandemic, during the pandemic, everything got mushed together. The year since the election, the early part of the year seems to have disappeared from my brain. I know it happened, but what happened there? I know I remember my wife had a party when she retired. It was lovely, but there it seems disjointed and no longer coherent. Like there's this new breaking wave of reality has overwhelmed my sense of coherence about the year. And I'm just left with, the feeling adrift right now, in a very tumultuous sea. So that's kind of what's going on in terms of trying to reflect back on the year. Like I know some things happened, and that, Italy stands out very strongly because it's recent. I spent the month of October there, and I'm going to move there. But before that, it's really hard for me to recall specifics. I don't know. And so, Gil, thanks for bringing that up, because I thought I was the only person having that happen. So
Apparently, definitely not. Please.
Yeah, I have the same thing. I know I'm not even living in America. It's like there's since the election, and then there's this vague sort of out of focus 7 or 8 months and plenty of things happened in Europe too during that time. I think I'm not quite sure I can remember all of them. You know what I mean? It seems like it's like a before and after thing. I feel that very strongly. But you just mentioned you're moving to Italy. Good choice. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm wondering, are there many people as Americans? I mean, I'm asking the Americans specifically. Are there many? Because after every election in America, there's always this, lots of people are going to move, and it doesn't seem to happen. Is it going to happen this time? Are there people actually seriously thinking about, because I saw an article in the New York Times just yesterday or today saying, everybody's saying they're going to move to Europe. Don't move to Europe, because the fascists are also, doing very well here. And that's absolutely true. Italy, France, various other, really big countries. Definitely things aren't really looking that hot over here either. But I'm wondering, is just a quick straw poll, are many Americans actually seriously considering moving, or just going to tough it out because it's another 4 years and see what happens?
We don't know yet.
I don't know whether this is that sort of forum. It's more of a question to the group rather than my own personal reflection there, but I was thinking about that the other day.
Anybody?
Nobody knows.
The
I,
uncertain sea, right? Yeah.
I saw a post from a fringy friend, meaning they're several steps removed from me, who was saying, I don't know what I'm going to do here. This whole climate is, I don't understand where I am, where my place is, anything. I guess I just don't belong anymore. And one of the first comments was, well, I'm someone else. I'm moving to insert other country here. And she responded with the harshest, how can you leave at a time like this?
Oh,
We
yeah.
all need like, and so it was a very interesting.
I didn't think
don't
of that dynamic.
I don't belong here. And then someone said, well, you know, we happen to
Fight
be
for your
leaving
place.
Yeah. And then, well, you can't leave. How can you leave all the people who need our help? So,
Okay.
Klaus,
Yeah.
Klaus was about to step in a moment ago. Let me go to Klaus, then Hank, then Gil.
Yeah, I was just about to say I don't see it happening. And it's really no solution, as you already indicated, Matthew. I mean, the pathology of the Western world is, in the Western world. So you have pretty much the same issues in Europe right now as you have in the US. It may be more profound in the US.
Thank you. Hank?
Just to react to what was just said, or also by Matthew, a counter note. There's a Netflix series called Transatlantic, which in a fictional way talks about some people in Europe in the 1920s, especially the late 1920s, knowing that it was important to leave. And then, as we probably all know, lots more people in the 1930s, the early 1930s at any rate, knew they had to leave Europe, and they did. The vast majority, 95% of the population, thought it won't get that bad. We'll tough it out, and they'll never do what they'll say they do, and a lot of them perished. Just to count them on.
I had never heard of this series, Hank. It's thank you, because that's my family history is exactly that. I will sign up and see what's up. Another interesting series to watch, it's a German series called Babylon Berlin, which is extremely good. It's well acted, well scripted, well shot, the whole thing. Just, put the English subtitles on, but it's just beautifully done, and it gives you some of these ideas. But there was so much disbelief that this might happen. Gil and Jose, I think you you raised your hands at the same time. Let me just go with the order here. So let's go Jose and then Gil.
Just a little bit about moving. I'm a Portuguese American Canadian, and the idea of moving back to Portugal is appealing. But moving back to Canada, I'd still be under Trump at the moment. A lot of my friends in Canada are reacting very strongly to Trump's latest about Canada being the 51st state and all that good stuff. It's really interesting because they used to say that when I was there. A lot of Canadians would talk about, well, we feel like we're the 51st state, like they treat us like we feel like blah blah blah. And now I'm really, there's quite a backlash in Canada right now. And
Canada does conveniently have the same country code.
Oh, well, in that case.
well, the fact that Bell was in Canada at the time didn't hurt. So funny. But But when I'm in Portugal and I talk to friends there, they're like, why would you come here? It's worse here. Things are much more complicated here. And you know, the whole European Union thing, the whole every state's struggling with economics, with politics. It's not easy anywhere right now, is what I'm hearing from folks. I was in Italy a few months ago, and or I guess a month and a half ago, and the folks there were a little less pessimistic, but pretty much the same. It's like, yeah, we're just sort of doing our thing and just trying to ignore the politics because it's just a mess everywhere. So I even though it crosses my mind, I kind of like, if I'm feeling this, a lot of people are feeling this. This isn't just a California thing or a US thing.
Love that. Gil, you were in the queue.
Yeah, a lot of people are feeling this, Jose. The question of fight or flee is a really tough one. Is, you know, when is it so bad that you got to get out of Dodge? When is it not so bad? When do you stay and work where you are? It's, you know, and people made that decision in Germany in the 1930s. You know, and some of them made the wrong decision. And I wonder about that in very practical terms. I like the question of when, you know, what would be the circumstances in which that would meet. I have thought, and I have friends who thought about moving to Europe. I was with a family member last night who's of French ancestry, longing to be back with the ancestral folks, and folks in France are moving here because the anti-Semitism is rising for them. So which way do you go? You know, there seems to be a movement within the United States of people moving to the state color that is more comfortable for them. But that just increases the polarization, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have the looming insurance crisis and people being priced out of affordability of their homes, particularly in coastal and climate vulnerable regions, and insurers withdrawing. So we're going to see insurance refugees, perhaps. There's the whole phenomena that we're just seeing the beginnings of climate refugees,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and potentially 1 billion people on the move in our lifetimes, which is something we haven't seen ever. And all the consequent political and economic implications of that. But, you know, one of the questions, and Jose, you said this, and I think others have said this, like, where would you go? You know, I have a pal who's been on the board of the Red Cross, and I talked with him about this, of living here in the Bay Area and with earthquakes and fires and all that stuff. He says, you know, you're probably one of the safest places you can be. Not just because of the climate driving factors, but the culture and infrastructure and political resources that are here. And so, you know, the question for me in this part of the conversation is, number one is, where would you go? And number two, where will you stand? Because at some point we have to stand somewhere and fight for something, or live
Mm-hmm.
something. And Stacy, deep respect to you for the move to North Carolina and the way that you are moving in that move. I can't imagine that's a simple thing to do, but I feel
You're muted, Stacy.
I feel the heart in that, Stacy.
Yeah.
I'm done.
You're still muted. You've lost our window. Okay. You'll figure it out. Two things before I go to Klaus. One is I'm involved in planning a Zoom conversation around responses to climate change, and specifically Pacific Islanders as sentinel populations, a term I had never heard before. But the people of the Pacific Islands, what happens to them and how they respond to it is going to be a lead indicator of a lot of different populations around the world. And then second thought is, one of the other standout moments of 2024 for me was Hank last week sharing with us that a lot of European media are preparing their populations for war.
Yeah.
And NATO has, in some sense, I'll put this in air quotes, but NATO has kind of done its job for a bunch of years since World War II, but we might be due for or overdue for something way more apocalyptic than we think the present situation is, which doesn't make me happy at all. But Hank, you kind of woke me up to that possibility.
Did I just jump in for a sec here, Klaus?
Go ahead.
Ken, I think it was on our call last week that one of our colleagues in Switzerland said that he just received in the mail a package of iodine tablets from the government. Not a lot of explanation of why, but that happened, and that's part of
Did
this.
did it
Charles
include a link to
Glass.
what to?
No, Charles Glass
Oh,
said
okay.
he said that one day there was a pack in the mail of iodine tablets. No explanation or nothing, just government sent them iodine tablets.
Did it include a link to watch the series Chernobyl?
I don't know, but
I think the link is less about a nuclear reactor melting down than the possibility of open theater nuclear weapons.
For sure.
So lots of countries are, you can call this fear mongering, or you can call it responsible preparation for contingency of like, how do we prepare people for the possibility that this could happen? There's a YouTube, I don't know if I can find it quickly, conversation between John Mearsheimer, American political theorist, what do they call it? He's considered like one of the realist rather than ideological geopolitical analysts, and Alexander Durgin, who is Putin's whisperer. An open conversation between the two of them, and it is scary as shit.
If you had a brain, I mean that in the nicest way, you would be able to find that video as quickly as this.
Well, you're going to find it faster than me. I know that.
Yeah, yeah.
But one of the things that Durgin says is, you guys think Putin wouldn't use nuclear weapons, but you're wrong.
Yeah.
It's worth reading Durgin over the past 10 years.
It's actually just Dugin, D-U-G-I-N.
Thank you, Dugin.
Yep.
Because I've been looking for this quote that I thought was from Putin, but I found it from Dugin from 2015, talking about the larger strategy of shredding the social fabric of the United States. And there's detail about how, but to me, that's what I see happening around us. Russia.
Klaus, thank you for your patience.
Yeah, I find all this talk very understandable and feel quite the same way. But on the other hand, as we are moving into 2025, I think we need to have a plan, right? Sort of an idea of where do we engage and how do we engage, because there's no question that conflicts will escalate. There's no question, because when you look at the Middle East, I mean, they're basically running out of food now. I mean, they have huge water issues. The Israelis are just out of their mind in using violence, preemptive violence, and all this stuff. There's even a rumor that they were using a small nuclear device a few days ago, was circulating on LinkedIn. So that's all a given. And for the Europeans, I mean, let's face it, the Europeans have had an amazing ride post-World War II, not having to invest in a significant military force, not feeling threatened and all this. And now all of a sudden this is coming to, a hard stop where you realize that maybe that was naive, because after all, human nature hasn't changed. And there are also big fat sitting ducks there. In a world that is deprived of so many resources, but in the middle of all this, we shouldn't forget that we're also damaging the planet. We are causing significant harm to the life support system that we depend on, and we can't stop thinking about this. So when I see this McKinsey report, I'm going, oh my gosh. I mean, it's just the insistence on continuing this damage, to nature, and just pretending like it doesn't matter is heartbreaking. But on the other hand, we can't, we have to find a way to get to the hearts and minds of people, right? We have to continue educating, making things transparent, explaining, right? And hopefully bending the curve a little bit. And at some point in time, something may break, just like Syria just broke, and something, there may be a natural disaster event or something may happen, and all of a sudden we want to change. We realize let's change, but then we need to know what to do, right? So we have to continue building the knowledge base and the understanding and the education on here's what we could be doing, and maybe the moment comes when it will actually, I mean, when it will actually be possible. But by goodness, we cannot dissolve in tragedy. I mean, we just have to keep going, and we just have to find a way of becoming louder, in the message that we have, in a nice way, in a good way, in a non-aggressive way, but just become louder and pursue this good fight here.
Louder, or more of an earworm, or more convincing, or something, but we need to reach and affect more people with what you're saying. Thanks, Klaus. Stacy.
Yeah. Thank you, Klaus. And thank you, Gil. And I just want to say, I also am keeping my place in New York, because both places require very different approaches. And I just want to point out that the polarities and the alliances in each of those places are even different. And as far as having a plan, the plan is grow food and build relationships. That's the plan. That's it.
Love
I'm
that.
done.
That's all right. Matthew, I think you had your hand up earlier. Nope. Okay. We are a little bit over time, and Mr. Homer has unmuted, which I think marks the end of this call with perhaps a poem.
This has been a tough one. I've got like 5 or 6 poems I could read, but I'm gonna go with Christopher Fry. But before I do, because it uses the word God here, and I believe Gil is a friend with Rabbi Menachem Creditor, and he's got, to me, one of the greatest quotes on God that I've ever encountered. He says, "God is the collective potential of human imagination." So with that in mind, here's the poem. It's called "Asleep of Prisoners." The human heart can go to the lengths of God. Dark and cold we may be, but this is no winter now. The frozen misery of centuries breaks, cracks, begins to move. The thunder is the thunder of the flows, the thaw, the flood, the upstart spring. Thank God our time is now, when wrong comes up to face us everywhere, never to leave us till we take the longest stride of soul men ever took. Affairs are now soul size. The enterprise is the exploration unto God. What are you making for? It takes so many thousands of years to wake, but will you wake for pity's sake?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. What was the name of the
Asleep of Prisoners by Christopher Fry.
Thank you.
Hmm.
This was a very sobering call, and it's the last call of 2024, the last of these. We will see everybody on the flip side, and maybe talk about what is the plan, what can we do, etc. next week. Although it'll be the first call of the month, so maybe we'll just do a check-in, and then we'll head into this stuff on the second week. So thank you all for this. Really appreciate all of your being here the way you are.
Have a happy New Year.
Have a happy
And
New Year,
have,
everyone.
and have a happy new year. Yeah.
Everybody,
Cheers.
Thanks.
bye now.